Okay. Welcome to the 9th hearing of the Public Accountability Committee's inquiry into the government's management of the COVID-19 pandemic. The inquiry is intended to provide ongoing parliamentary oversight to the government's response to the unfolding pandemic. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past and present of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginal persons present. Today marks the beginning of the next phase of hearings for this inquiry. This morning we'll hear evidence from non-government organisations as the voices for vulnerable communities and households experiencing financial hardship and housing stress as a result of the pandemic. Since the start of the crisis, we've heard a lot about the toll of the pandemic described in sobering numbers and statistics. What is often missing is the in-depth insights from a grassroots level which better illustrate the true human cost of the pandemic, insights that put a human face to the statistics and indicators. These insights form the focus of this morning's session. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. I would also remind media representatives that you must take responsibility for what you publish about the committee's proceedings. It is important to remember that parliamentary privilege does not apply to what witnesses may say outside of their evidence at the hearing. And so I urge witnesses to be careful about any comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence, as such comments would not be protected by parliamentary privilege if another person decided to take an action for defamation. The guidelines for the broadcast of proceedings are available from the Secretariat. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised they can take a question on notice and provide an answer to the committee within 21 days. I remind everyone here today that committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. I therefore request that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. I now welcome our first witness. Could each witness, starting from my left, please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Joanna Quilty, CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Leo Patterson-Ross, Chief Executive Officer of the Tenants Union of New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Catherine McKernan, CEO of Homelessness New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Lucy Bergman, Country Manager Australia for Community Housing Limited. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would any of the witnesses present like to make a short opening statement of no more than a couple of minutes?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear with my colleagues today. As you know, NCOS works for people experiencing poverty and disadvantage and is the peak body for the social and community services sector in New South Wales. It's certainly been a very difficult year for people in New South Wales, and it's not over yet. Many have lost loved ones, they've lost livelihoods, and they're facing years of uncertainty. But we know that many people were already doing it tough before COVID-19 struck. When we released our Mapping Economic Disadvantage in New South Wales report in October 2019, we knew that there were close to 900,000 people in New South Wales living below the poverty line. The analysis told us that women experience higher poverty rates than men, and that children are the age group most likely to be impacted. That there is wide variation in the distribution of poverty across New South Wales. That having a job doesn't make you immune to disadvantage, and that it is renters, whether in the social housing system or the private market, that are the housing tenure most likely to live below the poverty line. These statistics were further borne out by our cost of living survey, also conducted pre-COVID in 2019. Our survey included households on moderate as well as low incomes and people in the workforce as well as those out of it. The results of the survey made it clear that across the board, many households were feeling the pinch and that the big killer was housing costs, leaving a huge hole in the weekly budget. The survey results highlighted the quite drastic steps that households take to manage cost of living pressures, such as limiting their use of energy, selling items for cash and going without meals, and that financial hardship is associated with reduced contact with family and friends. So if things were grim for many households in New South Wales before COVID, our concern is that they're about to get a whole lot worse. At the moment, JobKeeper and the JobSeeker supplement are cushioning the blow. But we know that as these measures taper off and indeed potentially disappear altogether, more households are going to be thrown into very dire circumstances. And it's those who were already in precarious positions who will be hardest hit, on top of whole new cohorts who will be experiencing hardship for the first time. And as disadvantage rises, so too will demand for support from the social services sector. Our sector has done a really amazing job in stepping up and collaborating with the government to find solutions, keep vulnerable people safe and continue to provide essential services under difficult circumstances. But we know that when times are tough and economies are under pressure, governments often adopt austerity budgets that impact most severely on those without economic means. We're also concerned that an austerity budget will have adverse consequences for a social services sector already at capacity and looking down the barrel of a huge surge in demand. I think there's no doubt that the New South Wales Government has provided strong leadership and, in the main, an effective health-led response to the immediate challenges posed by the pandemic. But we need to turn our attention to the long game. One practical thing that the New South Wales Government could do to deliver longer-term benefits, to lessen disadvantage, ease the load on the social services system, create jobs in the residential construction industry, and build public assets of lasting value, is to seriously invest in social and affordable housing. We're hoping that proposals already put forward by a coalition of peak bodies, the main one being establishment of a social and affordable housing capital fund as the vehicle to supply 5,000 additional units of social housing every year for the next 10 years, is receiving serious consideration, and that it will get the support and the financial backing that it deserves, because it is an effective fiscal policy lever that the state government has at its disposal and that will address the social and economic challenges we're facing and deliver long-term benefits for the people of New South Wales when it's needed most. Thank you.
Thank you, Committee. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So the Tenants Union is the peak body representing the tenants' interests in New South Wales. We are a resourcing body for a statewide network of tenants' advice and advocacy services, and we're a community legal centre specialising in residential renting laws. We've been assisting people with the effects of COVID-19 since late January, when international students and others affected by travel bans began to be unable to travel back to New South Wales to perform their legal contracts. As the pandemic grew, we began to see people in tourism and hospitality also affected, and an expanding of related employment types from there. By the end of March, we were talking to people already sleeping in their cars because they could not afford to make the rent. The experience of policy development during this period was very difficult, and we'd like to acknowledge ministers, their staff and departments trying to do their best in a very tough situation. One of the barriers to policy development was, and still is, not having sufficient data to show the needs and the effects of policy changes. In New South Wales and Australia generally, government simply does not know the answers to some very fundamental questions about our rental system. For instance, no one can answer how many tenants are evicted in any given week, let alone why they're being evicted or why anyone is moving. This is slowly improving. Since 2016, the New South Wales Government has been releasing bonds data in an open source way, and that has enabled us to be able to get better transparency. And we're awaiting the release of the bond exit survey, which I can talk about more. But more needs to be done to give transparency and understanding of the sector in order to be able to make the decisions that we know need to be made. One thing we can see is that many people have needed to move out, losing their whole bond, which means they've either paid a break fee to break a contract early or they're in significant rent arrears. 4,318 people moved out and lost their whole bond in April, May and June in the inner ring of Sydney this year, and that's more than twice as many as the same period last year. The Tenants Advice and Advocacy Program did receive a one-year increase of $2.5 million, or just over about 20% of the total program funding, which translates into the equivalent of about 20 extra people answering phones, helping people with their tenancy problems. However, the TAP program hasn't received a funding increase in real terms for more than 15 years, and in that time the number of people renting has increased by more than 50%. That means that we estimate a funding shortfall exists every year of about $5 million. And so as the extra funding was very useful, very valuable, it was still plugging a gap that already existed. This pandemic has again proven the importance of this information, the advice, the advocacy that the workers give. In just 1 month, our Renters Guide to COVID served 1.2 million sessions. The number of callers to Tenants Advice and Advocacy Services who are having trouble paying rent rose from our average of about 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 in April to June quarter, which is the most recent stats I have. Our worries going forward are the ending of the eviction moratorium in October. This legislative response for tenants during COVID was a fairly limited change from the Residential Tenancies Act. It required landlords to show that they had attempted negotiation before evicting tenants who are defined as COVID impacted for rent arrears, and then lengthening the period of time for for the end of fixed term tenancy agreements. This support will end just weeks after the federal income support changes, and tenants and landlords will need to be renegotiating already difficult rent reduction negotiations without the framework, without the support that has been put in place. So we're very worried that that will put everybody in a much tougher position. Our response in New South Wales didn't prevent financial harm for many people, but it did prevent a wave of homelessness in the first round. We do need to make sure that that doesn't occur in the second tranche. I note that this week the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal actually has extended their phone hearings until at least the end of the year. And that means that they will be hearing and making decisions about whether someone needs to be forced to leave their home without thinking it's safe enough for someone to leave their home to come into the tribunal. I think we need a consistency in decision making and a consistency in messaging about what is safe and what is appropriate during this pandemic. Thank you.
Ms. McKernan?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would also like to acknowledge we're on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Homelessness New South Wales is a peak organisation representing around 120 homelessness services across the state, ranging from large charitable organisations right down to small locally based services. New South Wales was facing a homelessness crisis prior to the pandemic. It increased by 37% in 2011 to 2016 in the state compared to 14% nationally. And services in 2018-19 supported over 73,000 clients, which is 27% more than they're actually contracted and funded to work with. More clients are unable to access crisis accommodation than accepted, and even if supported by a homelessness service, 2 in 3 are still homeless after support. Services are exhausted and tired, and they have also this year had to deal with bushfires alongside the pandemic. Addressing homelessness is critical to the success of a health-based approach to the pandemic, given the lack of ability to isolate and socially distance for those rough sleeping or in shared crisis accommodation or those at risk of homelessness. The New South Wales Government has done a really fantastic job in securing funding to provide additional funding for hotel accommodation, rental subsidies and supportive housing for people sleeping rough. We've seen $72 million provided to the service system during the course of the pandemic to address these issues. The sector and the department have worked intensively and collaboratively to keep people healthy and well, with reconfiguring crisis accommodation, moving thousands into hotels and now working to house people. This has been incredibly positive, and we are all keen to maintain a solutions-focused and collaborative approach going forward. However, the issues that were in the system prior to the pandemic have created significant barriers during the process of working with people during the pandemic. As my colleague said, one of the main issues is a lack of joined-up data and referral systems, which created gaps in supporting clients. We had overly administrative processes for accessing hotels, causing anxiety and uncertainty for clients, and a huge amount of work for homelessness services and department staff in managing. And this meant that many clients returned to rough sleeping because of the gaps. We had an underfunded service system, meaning services have done all this work with limited additional resources and are at risk of burnout and exhaustion, and the challenge of increasing complexity of trauma experienced by people that they are working with. There has been a lack of Aboriginal specialist services in the system for many years, and resourcing to provide culturally safe approaches for Aboriginal people during this period has been incredibly challenging. 30% of all clients in homelessness services are Aboriginal, and a significant number of people sleeping rough are Aboriginal. There was also a lack of joined-up approach between health, housing and justice, and so we found challenges as well for people leaving prison in terms of making sure that they have housing and support to go to once they've exited prison. And, as my colleagues have said, we're seeing new cohorts of people experiencing homelessness during this period, particularly non-citizens and single mums who have impacted by either lack of access to services or loss of incomes and high rents. 39% of services have reported an increase in demand during this period. The cuts, as mentioned by Joanna, the cuts to JobSeeker and JobKeeper are looking like creating a huge demand for homelessness services in the next 6 months. Modelling that we've done with Equity Economics predicts there could be up to 16,000 additional people experiencing homelessness due to the economic impacts of COVID and with any reduction of JobSeeker. The biggest issues we have is a lack of social housing and an underfunded service system. We are using existing resources, apart from the 72 million, which is great to receive, but other than that, we're using existing resources to scramble to provide outcomes. We need an investment of 50,000 social housing properties, and we need an increase of funding to homelessness services to help them provide the support to clients that need it. What we've shown during this period is that we can end homelessness. We just need the investment, the resource and the will to do it. And so I think what would be really great is to see that activity continue over a long term so that we can really end homelessness in New South Wales.
Thank you. Dr Burgood.
Thanks very much. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal land and pay respects to Elders past, present and emerging. Community Housing Limited, CHL, we're the largest not-for-profit housing provider in Australia. We provide affordable housing to vulnerable and low-income people and moderate-income people as well who are unable to secure affordable rental housing in the private rented sector. We provide services across 6 states in Australia as well as 7 overseas jurisdictions. Here in New South Wales, we manage a diverse portfolio of social and affordable housing, housing for Aboriginal people and specialist disability accommodation, from Bega in the south to Lismore in the north. The vast majority of our services are based on the mid-north coast around Port Macquarie and Kempsey. Over 4,700 people live in a CHL property in New South Wales, and we serve over 1,000 people seeking housing assistance every year as well. And I just wanted to comment that CHL, we're very pleased that the committee is choosing to focus this element of the hearings on housing and homelessness amongst your very broad terms of reference. These are important public policy areas at all times, and with increasing concerns about low-income and vulnerable people's ability to stay safe and to stay out of poverty, the imperative to provide safe, affordable, appropriate housing has never been more apparent. And for all the creditable efforts of the New South Wales Government focused on homelessness prevention, new supply for new social and affordable housing remains quite a gap. Thanks.
Thank you. Before we proceed to questions, I can indicate that as well as the committee members here in the room, we have Mr David Shoebridge and the Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox participating by phone. Mr Shoebridge is in fact the chair of this inquiry, but he's unable to attend today due to being in isolation while he awaits his COVID-19 test results. In the interim, the committee has asked me to chair the inquiry until the deputy chair should arrive, but after consultation, he informs me that he's happy for me to continue. So until my credit with the committee runs out, I will proceed. Who wishes to ask the first question? Ms Sharp?
Until they want someone fair.
I'm happy to start. I'm happy to start. Thanks very much. And can I just say, on behalf, I think, of all of us, we want to thank the work that the community sector has done during what's been a very difficult time. There's a number of questions that I wanted to ask, and you touched quite a lot of it in your opening statement. But the one thing I did want to ask is you've talked about how important JobKeeper and Job Seeker are. I'm just wondering whether you can just elaborate in terms of the people who've fallen through the gaps. So, international students, where are the people that are hidden, really, who are really doing it tough, who don't have access to any of the extra support, and what are your services seeing in terms of the people that are coming forward? Let's start with that.
So certainly we are aware that there are various groups that are falling through the cracks, and as you mentioned, asylum seekers and refugees who don't have access to income support and other measures that are available are certainly a cohort around which there's a lot of concern. We also know that people with disabilities have tended to not receive the attention that they need to during this pandemic. They are a group that are more likely to live in poverty, who are less likely to own their own home, and who are extremely vulnerable. And they've been at risk, not just in terms of the health impacts of the pandemic, but I think also in terms of social isolation and not being able to access the usual services and supports that would assist them. We also know that social housing tenants are a very, very vulnerable population group, that often they're elderly, they can have chronic health conditions, they can also have disabilities, and that they tend to not receive the wraparound supports that would assist them to fully participate in the community. And I think this pandemic has really highlighted the cracks in our system, and as you say, the people that are at risk of falling through those cracks.
Can I just follow up on the disability question? I mean, do you think this has been the first test really of the NDIS versus other support services? I mean, have you seen emerging gaps in terms of what was state provision and now that sort of idea that an individual's completely responsible for their own, managing their own process? I mean, has that I suppose, demonstrated some gaps that have emerged?
I think it absolutely has. We know that only 10% of people with a disability will be eligible for the NDIS, so there's a huge proportion of people in New South Wales with a disability who are in fact not eligible for it. But that even to be eligible and to qualify for the NDIS, you've got to have a really high degree of persistence in order to navigate what is a really complex system. And we suspect that there are many people out there, very vulnerable people who may be in social housing, who may in fact be homeless or living in inadequate conditions, who should qualify for the NDIS, but who are not able to navigate that system, who don't have any supports that would help them, and who are therefore being placed at further risk because they're not getting those supports and that assistance that would help them to live a life that, you know, has higher quality.
Thanks. Mr. Patterson-Ross, I wanted to ask you, the government announced a range of measures to support tenants and landlords through the process. Obviously, there's the land tax reduction, which we know is very undersubscribed. Would you be able to tell the committee what your experience through the calls were in terms of resolving issues with landlords and tenants? Are you able, I suspect you may not be able to, any kind of data around, I mean, what's been reported to us is that lots of tenants, you know, were seeking rent reductions and they just haven't been forthcoming and they've been at a stalemate. Is it also the case that the moratorium sort of holding that off, but we could see a wave of problems? So if you just comment generally on what the government promised versus how useful that's been for tenants and landlords to put in practice.
Yeah, thank you. So, as you know, our response in the residential tenancy sector is largely to encourage negotiation between the parties, with a requirement on landlords who want to evict for rent arrears to have to negotiate, to have shown that they have negotiated before that process would proceed all the way through the tribunal. We saw a range of differences across the time frame. So for the first couple of months, we saw, very early on, we saw landlords coming forward and offering rent reductions and saying, look, I have enough money, I'm okay, can I help you? We saw a limited number of that at the very beginning. That dried up very quickly. Then while we were waiting for the announcements and the specifics of the program, we did see a lot of offers of rent deferral rather than rent waiver. So sometimes tenants would be told, look, pay what you can, and then you can fix it up later. A rent deferral, unfortunately, is just rent arrears by another name. It is sitting there waiting, and if you don't pay it, you're going to be evicted. So it is not going to solve the financial problem for someone unless they have a reasonable expectation that their employment will gain them more income after the pandemic rather than they were receiving beforehand. That's unlikely for the vast majority of people. Once the eviction moratorium came in, we still saw a big push from the industry generally towards rent deferrals. And it wasn't until we were able, and New South Wales Fair Trading through the customer service cluster was able to clarify that they really did mean waivers, and that landlords and agents started to take the negotiation process somewhat more seriously. As you know, we also had a two-phase moratorium. The first two months was you could not be evicted at all for rent arrears if you were defined as COVID impacted. The second phase, that was June until October, is where the tribunal must be convinced that a negotiation occurred. So for the first 2 months, there was negotiation happening, but there was no test through the tribunal. So no one really knew what the tribunal would take into consideration about what constituted good faith. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty about how that process would look. There are fairly small numbers have gone through the tribunal on a rent negotiation platform, largely because what the eviction moratorium didn't do was prevent evictions for other reasons than rent arrears. So no grounds evictions, end of fixed terms, which are also no grounds, where you don't have to give a reason, you don't have to show that you've negotiated. These tools were still available to a landlord who didn't particularly want to negotiate. But I think I'll just also point to the model assumed that a landlord would want to evict a tenant. And actually, if you're a landlord in the eastern suburbs or the inner ring of the CBD and you're seeing vacancy rates shoot up, it actually becomes not the most rational choice to evict that tenant, because if you don't evict them, you have at least a paper debt. They do owe you the money. If you evict them, you've got a vacant property that you may not be able to fill. And so what we did start seeing as well was a lot of landlords choosing not to go down the route of an eviction, but just sitting back and waiting while the rent arrears debt grew, and hoping that either that tenant would find employment soon and be able to pay back that arrears debt, or that some support from government, some financial support would kick in, and they'd be able to take that as the sort of to offset the debt. Whereas if they were sitting with a vacant property, they wouldn't be getting, they wouldn't have those options as likely. So we saw some what might be seen as perverse kind of responses, but they are rational if you put yourself in the landlord's shoes and consider what's the least risky move. And our system didn't allow for that. One of the big flaws in our system compared to other states and other jurisdictions is that nowhere at fair trading or the tribunal can a independent arbiter say this is what the rent reduction should be. You've done your best, you've kind of had a go at both sides, you're not clear where you're at, this is what it should be. We've taken into account all the things. At the tribunal, a landlord just gets a binary, yes, you've done enough, or no, you haven't, go away and try again.
So there's no room there. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, but can I just ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
And you can tell me I'm wrong, because many people do. It seems to me, at least in the eastern suburbs and the centre of Sydney, that two things are happening. The first thing is, well, perhaps three things are happening, but the first thing is there seems to be, as you've already indicated, an increasing level of vacancy of particularly units. And could I suggest that part of that is that the vacancy is caused by a move away from Airbnb at the moment, so that unit accommodation that previously wasn't available to renters is suddenly available because there's no Airbnb market, or a very reduced Airbnb market.
No tourists.
That being the case, what we're seeing again, at least in the eastern suburbs and the centre of Sydney, is a reduction in rents, and not insignificant reductions in rents. Is that correct?
The median rent has fallen. I'll come back to the Airbnb question, but the median rent has fallen. When you start stratifying the sector,
Yep.
and we can do this through the bond lodgements, the lower end, so the lower quintile, hasn't really shifted very much.
And is that because it's not the sort of... Oh, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
So what it is actually the top end. Now, and that brings the median down because the Airbnb question is tricky. In Sydney, there's been a large debate. I mean, I think this committee, or certainly many of you on it, have been considering the short-term rental legislation. This is another area where we don't have transparency. The big flaw in most of the studies around Airbnb or short-term letting in Sydney, and actually across the world, is people don't know what the property was being used for before it went to Airbnb and what it's being used for in between Airbnb stays. It may be an owner-occupied property. They vacate on the weekend. They do that every weekend, but it's actually their home the rest of the time. We don't have any way of telling whether it's that case or a completely commercial, quasi-hotel setup. And I think they make significant differences to the response in, for instance, a reduction in tourism. If it's the owner-occupied property where they're losing some extra income, but actually they were still living in the property, doesn't change the vacancy rate at all. And so, whereas the quasi-commercial hotel's decimated. So when we talk about those vacancy rates, I think that certainly some of them will have shifted from short-term letting. The other change we're seeing in the short-term letting market is people have moved to residential tenancy agreements of 3 months. So they're still advertising that it's for lease. And actually that brings properties onto the market, but not in the same way that a genuine tenancy would. And this points to a flaw in the vacancy rate methodology. So it's only measuring properties that are available for rent and how many of them are there compared to the Real Estate Institute's methodology is the real estate agent's rent roll, looking at the vacant properties that they have. It doesn't look at, for instance, a property that the landlord has just withdrawn from the market and is sitting vacant. The SQM's methodology is slightly different, looks at online listings and compares it more to the overall properties. But again, there's no transparency behind the limited sources that people are using to try and get the best answer that they can. So I wouldn't be very confident about saying what caused the particular vacancy. We also know that there were international students, we know that there's backpackers, we know there's a whole lot of people who live in some of these areas who have gone home. The other big trend that we've seen is people moving in with family if they can. So they might have been living in Bondi, but as COVID hit, they weren't able to afford their rent. They went back to mum and dad's in Epping or Parramatta or wherever. I think the other important thing to say is, yes, I think you've touched on this really. The inner ring, the vacancy rates have shot up. It's actually the tightest markets we've seen for years in places like Penrith and Campbelltown. Vacancy rates have gone really, really low. I think that's also because people have moved out of the expensive areas where the rents have fallen, but they haven't fallen anywhere near enough. And so they've moved to the more affordable areas of Sydney. And actually now, if you're trying to move there, if you already lived in Penrith and you're trying to find a new home, you're going to find it even harder than you were a year ago.
Thank you. Sorry.
I wanted to... This isn't really a state comparison. Other states provided actually hardship payments for tenants to overcome that. That wasn't the case in New South Wales. Do you think that there's some value in providing that, given what you've seen with the pattern of evictions and the difficulties that tenants have been in?
So New South Wales did provide one payment of a sort, which was the Rent Choice Assist COVID-19. Which had a very limited number of people could apply for it, and it was open for a short time. Its purpose was much more just directly at preventing homelessness, but rather than alleviating financial stress over time. But worth putting on the record that there was a program that existed.
Remind me how much that was and how long that was open for?
It was part of the 20 million that came for the rental subsidies, so it's part of the rental subsidies program. I think we'd have to take on notice what the actual
that's
amount
okay. We can
was
ask the
for rent.
department.
Yeah, exactly.
It would change, so we'd actually need advice from the department about what they assessed the need at. But it was significant, more significant than any of the other states' financial hardship payments. One of the difficulties of the rent relief payments from the other states and applying it here, we do need an independent arbiter of what the rent should be to ensure that the rent relief payment is targeted and effective at. We adopted a negotiation framework, and if we go down that path rather than simply reducing rents to affordable levels, then we need to make sure that that's done together rather than. One of the flaws I'd point to, for instance, is that in some of the states that you had to negotiate, you've come out of the process, you still are in an unaffordable rental level. You get this payment, which is the equivalent of a few weeks, potentially. For whatever period it ends up being because of the size of your rent relief, your rent negotiation, and then it goes away, and you're left with a rent that you can't afford. So although you had the relief for some time, it was going to end, and then you were going to be in hardship. So it might have delayed problems for you. I think it assumed that COVID would go away quickly. I think that model assumed that we would be done by now, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've got one more. People are happy?
I'm assuming the floor is yours unless somebody else wants to interject.
Okay, that's
I'm not seeking to interject.
No. Sorry. Or to ask a question.
I'm happy to ask.
I know.
That's all right. Ms. Kernan, like I mean, I actually know the amount of work that's happened in the homelessness sector, and it's been actually quite, to give the government credit, quite extraordinary what's been able to, things that previously thought impossible have actually become possible. I'm interested though in what you think now as we're going on and, you know, people are not staying in the hotels and there are more people on the street and we've seen this increased demand. I mean, what do you think are the key things that we need to, what's going to solve it forever? We've shown that it's actually possible to get people off the street. How do we find them somewhere secure and safe into the future?
Yeah, what's going to solve it forever is a considerable investment in social housing. As we've mentioned, we need 50,000 properties just to meet current demand. That's not with increased demand. And so a long-term investment into social housing would make a really big difference. And then structuring the system so that we're actually providing support to tenants rather than focusing on the crisis space. So really looking at expanding Together Home, which is the 36 million that was announced for rough sleepers, providing supportive housing, providing that in a long-term way for people sleeping rough, but also for any tenant that requires support to maintain their tenancy. That is really what will end homelessness, and we can do it. We've seen it in New South Wales, we've seen it in other states in Australia. There's been huge gains made in terms of providing housing for people, and we've seen it internationally. So yeah, we know how to do it. We just need to.
So in terms of ongoing funding, I mean, in the budget this year, you're obviously, I'm very familiar with NCOS's work and the 5,000 a year for 10 years, which I'll come back to in a minute. But really, the money that was being provided, which is the 73 million, which is sort of all of those breakdowns, that's time limited, I assume.
Yeah, it's time limited, and so Together Home is time limited for 2 years, and the other funding was essentially to meet the crisis. So rental subsidies, which are time limited as well, and then to provide hotel accommodation. So it is time limited, and so it's been an add-on to an under-resourced system. So what we need is to resource the service system, which means providing social housing to make things work. So we've done an incredible job. The government's done an incredible job, I'd have to say, in this period, but we've all been scrambling because we were under-resourced to start with. And so we've been making things work as best we can and getting much-needed temporary funds and funds on top. What we need is the system to be resourced adequately so we can provide the right housing, the right support to people.
That's good. Ms. Quilty, I was going to ask you to take us through a little bit more of the work that you've done around the 5,000 a year for 10 years around jobs creation, and really, I suppose, and ask you where it's up to in the system with the government.
So we know that the downturn in international migration is going to really put jobs in the residential construction industry at risk, and I think there's something like 85,000 jobs that will potentially go. And there's also a flow-on effect to small and medium enterprises across New South Wales. Something like 97,000 small to medium-sized businesses could be at risk of closing their doors because of the downturn in residential housing construction. And we also know from evidence looking at previous economic downturns that the recovery measures that are most effective are those that can be rolled out quickly, that focus on jobs and employment and business, and that can also, so can be rolled out quickly, focus on those things and fill infrastructure gaps. So certainly investing in social housing is a no-brainer when you look at what we're trying to achieve and the fact that it does tick all those boxes. So as Catherine said, the 5,000 is really just to meet existing demand. It's to meet the backlog. We know that there is a waiting list of 50,000 for social housing in New South Wales, that the available social housing stock hasn't kept pace with population growth, and that simply to have it at a level where it can meet demand and really help those very, very vulnerable households who are otherwise living in overcrowded conditions, living in really inadequate accommodation, having to live in areas that aren't well located, that aren't close to transport and amenities and services. In order to avoid that situation and to really support these families, we do need that investment as a minimum of 5,000 social housing units each year for the next 10 years. Our estimations are that will cost around $1.88 billion for the 5,000. So that would, of course, need to be multiplied over the 10 years. But that it does deliver those significant economic and social benefits at a time when it's desperately needed.
Anyone else?
No, keep going.
You go here. Why don't you go?
I just wanted, as that deals with existing demand, one of the figures that was raised in the opening statements is the potential for 16,000 extra people to experience homelessness in this crisis. How does the system cope with that? If that scenario unfolds, what would be required to hold things together under those circumstances?
The system won't cope. The system's barely coping at the moment. Before Christmas, the sector was feeling incredibly overworked and exhausted and received 1 year continuity of contract rather than long-term contracts, and was feeling really kind of despairing, and has now been hit with bushfires and the pandemic and have done a fantastic job, really worked very well with government and so on. But we've already seen that around 39% of services are reporting an increased demand. There just isn't the housing to provide to people, and there also isn't a prevention focus. So we need to not only have the social housing investment, but we also need to look at preventing people from becoming homeless. And so that's linked to the information that Leo was providing around people in the private rental market. The new clients we are seeing are, as has been mentioned, non-citizens, but also single mums who were working in casual jobs and were sharing houses with other single mums and just getting by. And the pandemic has just thrown them completely out, and they're having to access services for the first time. So we're anticipating we'll see more and more people who've never been in contact with the service system before, who will be who really just need rent. They need to be able to have affordable, incomes that they can, and affordable rent, so that they can actually live. They don't necessarily have the support needs that you would traditionally think of for people experiencing homelessness. It's just they need to have adequate income and affordable rents. And so we need to see Job Seeker and JobKeeper extended for as long as possible, and we need to be looking at social housing for those who will need it, but also looking at how the rental market can actually support those on really low incomes.
And just secondly, on the from a tenants union point of view, you've called for the existing protections to continue past, I think, October. Are you hopeful that that will occur? What, without going into too much detail, what discussions have you had? You think there's a need for that, but are you hopeful that will be the case?
I think the Minister's office has made clear that they are monitoring the evidence that is coming forward, and that they'll make a decision. I think it's reasonable for them to say we're going to make a decision closer to October. So we'd hope for a confirmation really by early September, so that people know, where they're going to be living, frankly, in October. But so that's a reasonable approach to look for the evidence and make a decision based on that. The problem, as I outlined, is we don't necessarily have the evidence coming through the system in the way that we need.
So what are the things that you want, that you think we need to be measuring that we're not?
So we're waiting at the moment for the bond exit survey to be released, and we understand that it's very close to release. The bond exit survey was a voluntary trial. It started actually over summer. It was a proposal that we'd put forward last year, where as someone claims a bond, they're asked 3 questions determining why the tenancy has ended, who initiated the ending, and then what the end rent was. So which no one knows at the moment. There's no data set that tells us what has happened to the rents within a tenancy. That will tell us the reasons why tenancies were ending. And that will give us a much better indication of, is this rent arrears, is this people leaving because they have rent arrears, or is it a landlord evicting because they have rent arrears, which are, need slightly different responses. Are they being evicted using no grounds evictions? It gives us the real data around this. This trial that started over September and over summer, and the government extended through COVID, or at least through the first couple of months of COVID, was a voluntary opt-in survey. So it won't have complete coverage. We understand there are a significant number that will give us a good sample size, but it really does need to form part of the bond claim process. It's just a mandatory, very quick questions, so that we have the complete visualization. We currently have bonds we currently have a release that tells us how long a tenancy ended, and how much of the bond was claimed by the agent or returned to the tenant for every single bond. So that they're already collated. It's de-identified data. It's not. There's no privacy issue there, but it gives us a much better indication of what's happening. We need more of that. I think that the other transparency or understanding that we are missing is the landlord's position. Do they own 20 properties? Do they own just one? What's the size of the mortgage? What is their usage? Do they swap between short-term rentals and residential tenancies, which we see a lot up and down the coast, for instance, that a residential tenancy agreement runs from March to October, and then it's short-term renting. And that means that people have to move, and it creates a very unstable environment for people. So this kind of transparency around how the property industry actually works. We know more about real estate.
Is that data provided by the ABS or?
So some of the tax stats, tax statistics to provide, we know how much, what people are claiming on their tax as deductions, and that can give you an okay indication, but not really. Particularly the short-term letting, the swap between, there would be no transparency through the ATO.
I've got some system questions.
And I've got one more.
Oh, Jill, you go. You guys go.
Yeah.
Okay, you two go, Trevor, and then Natalie.
I think, in all fairness and for the purposes of transparency, David has asked me to ask this, and Ms. McKernan, I think it relates to you. Mm-hmm. I think you indicated that you are now seeing an increase in the number of rough sleepers. I think that was.
There's people who've moved from the hotels back to rough sleeping.
Right,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I'll just check my text so I cover everything in that regard. Are you able to say now, in terms of those who are essentially returning to rough sleeping, what services are essentially now available for those people? It's a sort of a fairly radical change from staying at Ridges or better back onto the streets.
Yeah, so they're able to access the assertive outreach services that are around, and they're continuing to be offered hotel and motel accommodation, but it is no longer, it's being provided in the kind of closer to business as usual provision of hotel and motel accommodation that happened pre-pandemic. Yeah, I mean, the situation is that where Together Home is coming into play. People are being rapidly housed into that program, but there are more people in need of the program than there is housing available, and so we still have an issue where we're going to continue to have rough sleepers. And one thing we've been looking at is other jurisdictions and how they've been coping with that. And if you look at Victoria, for example, and obviously they're in a different situation at the moment with community transmission, but they've extended the hotel stays for people sleeping rough until April next year. One of the issues we're looking at the moment is that we are looking at, if there is increased community transmission, that we will have to stand up everything again. And so there's conversations that we're having with the department about how do we maintain this in a way so that we're planned for this and we're actually not having to up and down throughout the pandemic period, but actually provide consistent support to people. What we've seen for those who have accessed the hotel accommodation is that they've really thrived. Providing someone with a good quality hotel room and support means that people are really thriving in that environment. And so we're really hoping to provide as much housing and support, on long-term support to people as possible, because we'd rather see them, move into, long-term exiting homelessness forever and long-term housing and really thriving more broadly, rather than, ending back up on the street. I would say too that the people on the street are often people with more complex needs and who require that high level of support and that really intensive support as well. And so, we need the resources there to be able to provide people with housing and that high level of support that they need so that we can work with them to, end their homelessness. Yep.
Is there any, and this is my final question, is there any targeted testing for COVID in terms of rough sleepers?
Yep. So the local health district has worked really closely with the housing and homelessness services to put testing in place and be available for people sleeping rough and people in the hotels as well. So absolutely there is a process for that. Yep.
Natalie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all. I just wanted to reiterate that we're very appreciative of all the incredible work you've done in these very difficult times, and thank you for coming here today to help us with some further information. I was just interested in, I think, Ms McKernan, you talked about the lack of joined-up data. Am I correcting that? You mentioned that, and I was just interested in whether you could expand on that. And what has been the challenge and what you propose might assist in that. I think you talked about joining health and housing and homelessness and justice. And could you just help the committee out with some more information?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this was an issue prior to the pandemic too, in terms of silos around programs. But what that's meant as a kind of, I guess, practical example is when working with people sleeping rough to get them into the hotels and motels, you rang Link to Home, and they use the housing kind of programs for data recording. The homelessness services have a completely different data system that they use, and then health has their own system. So what we've found in terms of working in a rapid way to provide accommodation to people was that the information then had to be either collected 3 times by different people, and there were gaps in transferring that information, say from once the person was eligible for accommodation and moved into that accommodation, then there was a whole process that then had to happen again to make sure that the support providers had the right information around support. So it created a huge amount of work for everybody, Department Health and Homelessness Services, and it meant that people did fall through the gaps. It took time to get to people in terms of their support needs and understanding what was required. It took time in terms of food, making sure that people who are diabetic had the right food, or et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to look at how the thing that's been great around in this period has been the collaboration, and what we need is the systems to really enable that collaboration, to enable that information to be shared, obviously respecting privacy and confidentiality, but enabling that to work so we can all work efficiently together. Yeah.
Forgive me for not knowing the right terminology. I should. I think there was the homelessness audit, or the
the street count. The survey, end street sleeping. Yeah.
Is that sort of your starting point? Is that where you went from?
That would certainly be useful. We did look at using that information at the beginning because that was done in November, and there was over 300 people who were surveyed, and we were hoping that information would assist us. But unfortunately, it didn't really, again, because the data wasn't actually matching with the clients, if that makes sense. So again, if we had a plan and a planned approach, and I think we've got an inner city task force that's looking at people sleeping rough. That's worked really effectively. It's included police, it's included health, housing, and the sector. And what we would really love to see is a plan going forward around how do we make this work forever? How do we make sure our data is shared well? How do we troubleshoot and raise issues and work together well. And I think that's the solution going forward. Yep.
Be a career-limiting move on my part to suggest it, so others may wish to, but you almost sort of need a Service New South Wales for this sector, right? So you deal with...
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was kind of suggesting to the Minister was at the beginning was having a broader statewide level task force that was looking at the issue and really developing a plan going forward. I think we weren't able to stand that up for a whole range of reasons, but it was established in the inner city and it has really demonstrated what can be done collaboratively. So I'd be really keen to see something going forward.
Who's a part of that?
So it's chaired by...
that you mentioned?
Yeah. So,
Michelle?
Two last questions from me. The government's announced indexation for your organisations, the organisations that you represented, about 1.75%. Can you confirm that you've received that, and can you let me know where that's up to?
I think it has come through, yeah. We've all got our letters. It is only interim. It's just up until the budget and it only applies to wages, so it's not across the board.
And is it going to cover the national wage case in terms of equal pay for community sector workers? Is it sufficient to cover that?
So ERO is a separate issue.
And has that been resolved?
No. We are ongoing in terms of our advocacy on that issue, and
so can you just explain to the committee where that's up to?
So the Equal Remuneration Order was a Fair Work Commission determination that came in 2012 in recognition of the fact that the work of the sector, which is largely feminised, had been undervalued. So it brought in a series of payments over a period of about 10 years to achieve that equal pay, and the legislation that has guaranteed those payments comes to an end next year or at the end of this year, so there'll be one last payment that takes us through till next year. The intention was that those payments would then be ongoing. However, contracts that people are signing now do not make reference to ERO, and we are unclear as to whether in fact it will be ongoing. We have received from DCJ some assurances that don't worry, our intention is to continue to pay that and to roll what were supplementary payments into baseline funding, but we don't yet have contracts that reflect that. We have seen in some other parts of the system where those payments are going to be rolled into baseline funding, and that will be expressly dealt with in the contract. So we're suggesting to government that a consistent approach and providing that contractual assurity across the board would be a really positive thing.
Yes, I thought after 10 years we'd managed to roll those in by now, but not yet. So you're saying not yet?
Not yet.
Can I just, and so the other question I wanted to ask, I think it's Ms McKernan, is that, so the housing, so for homelessness services, you've had a rollover of your contracts for a year, so that the year's almost up. So you're now starting on a new round of contract negotiation.
Yeah, and we're yet to start that because of the focus that's been on ongoing service delivery. But yes, that's right. That's what will happen. And I think the big learning over 2020 is that we are essential services. The impact of going home, staying home in terms of providing disruption to the homelessness service system is well documented, and I think at this point in time we really need to just understand that we are an essential part of the service system. Disruption at any point, but let alone right now, is going to be very, very problematic. One of the things we haven't mentioned much, but we've been trying to also raise with the department around in this context is that a number of services will have issues with sustainability going forward due to the loss of philanthropic and charitable donations. Services use that funding to continue to top up their service delivery, and so we're quite concerned that we will see a loss of services over the next, within about 9 months' time due to their inability to go forward, and we're really keen to do some work with the government around how do we manage that issue, particularly given we are so essential.
I note that this round of questions time has expired, so I'd like to thank the 4 witnesses for their time and coming along today. I believe one question was taken on notice. The committee has resolved that answers to questions on notice be returned within 21 days, and the Secretariat will contact you in relation to the questions taken on notice. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.